Okay, Dad, today is Monday, August 19th, and let's cover what's happening in Ukraine and Russia first. So we'll talk about the Kursk incursion. Um, I want to know what you think Putin will do in response to this Kursk invasion, because I've been seeing some footage of Ukrainian soldiers wearing SS helmets. I believe one of the battalions that invaded Kursk was actually named after a Hitler Nazi battalion. Is that correct? Can you verify these things about these soldiers wearing SS helmets
Yeah.
and
Well, I've seen some of the videos, and yeah, I've heard that about one of, I don't know if it was a battalion or a regiment or, um, yeah, but one of them did adopt the name of you know, a name that harkened back to World War II days to the German army, and in particular to the SS. That's what I've heard. I can't verify
well,
that.
why would Ukraine even do this? I mean, surely the Ukraine and NATO should understand using Nazi symbols and Nazi names for your army doesn't go over well. What?
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's hard to explain a lot of the behavior on the Ukrainian side. I mean, you could have asked that question actually prior to the 2022 invasion, right? Why didn't the West do more to try to suppress the neo-Nazi activities, obvious use of Nazi symbols and so forth. Clearly this was kind of a red flag before the Russian Bowl, right? Um, but they didn't. In general, there was some criticism, like before 2022, you'd get some criticism in the U.S. and Europe about the presence of neo Nazis in Ukraine. After February 2022, it never happened. You're a bad person for even mentioning this, right? Um, yeah, it's clear. This is something. If you want to understand why the Russian government was so fearful about what was going on in Ukraine. Just think about its history again. 27 million people killed, and here in Ukraine, you have people who are actually celebrating, the army, the forces, the ideology that was responsible for that war, that war that resulted in 27 million deaths. So again, it just
The
seems like it
Nazi
was a
ideology.
right, exactly. And so anyway, again, it seems like it's almost a deliberate provocation. Now, I don't know if it was a deliberate provocation, but it had that effect, right? Um, and yeah, I think that's been the effect of like some of these more recent incidents. Again, there was the case of I guess there were a couple of Ukrainian soldiers who were wearing uh, German World War II helmets and had SS insignia, and were mocking this old Russian man, this man in his 70s, and speaking to him, referring to him in German and Russian, and the combination of the two as a Russian swine. So, and this got out. Russians saw this. The Ukrainians claimed that one of the purposes, one of the goals of this incursion is to sow fear among Russians, but it does not have that effect. I mean, you could say it's sowed fear among people who are right there on the border and are suffering the immediate effects of the incursion. But for the rest of Russia, it doesn't sow fear; it just sows fury, and it creates you went back to the original question, how is Putin going to react? Well, one thing is Putin's under a lot of pressure because of this. This was an embarrassment for him. It was a humiliation. It's part of what, the reason people support Putin is they see him as a protector, somebody who's going to keep the Russian nation strong and safe. And though I think in the long run this is not going to have much of an if, it's only going to be to the detriment of Ukraine's military effort. Um, in the short run, it is a humiliation. It looks real bad, and it's creating a lot of anger. I mean, I spoke to somebody yesterday whose husband used to actually work in the Kremlin, and he said that he's just furious about this. He's furious with Putin for letting this happen, and for in general for being too soft. for acting with too much restraint. And she said, it's like this is we, speaking of the Russian people in general, we can't take it anymore. This is, um, and I think that's not an unusual um, attitude. Again, support from Putin is obviously very strong, very wide. He won the recent election with 85% of the vote, approximately. But when he's criticized, he's not criticized for being um, too nationalistic or being too anti-Western. No, he's actually criticized for being too soft, for being too cautious. Uh, uh, and it always amazes me, to hear all the criticisms, all the the attacks directed against Putin in the West. You sometimes get the idea that Putin's the problem. That's the way that Western leaders often talk. If we get rid of this guy, then our problem's solved. No, if you get rid of him, he's the cautious guy. He's the logical one. He's the one who is the very rational one, the one who's always, for the longest time, was trying to establish some sort of, stable, friendly relationship with the West. If you get rid of Putin, you're very likely going to end up with a hothead like Medvedev, right? Who's
Medvedev.
Medvedev, yeah. um, you're going to end up with somebody like him, uh, who who is not restrained, right? Who is not cautious, who is unapologetically nationalist and anti-Western. That's what you're going to get. So, yes, you want to know like how Putin's going to react? Well, I don't know exactly, but one thing clearly, he's feeling pressure from a lot of people, for being too soft on the Ukrainians. And so he will feel pressure to react forcefully in some way or another. But I think in the short run, it's just there's a practical question of stopping this incursion and reversing it. And that's what, the Russian armed forces are doing. They've um, they've established there was the first several days where the area was really in chaos. The again, the Ukrainians had sent in a lot of these small units that that created chaos, fairly deep into Russian territory, but did not have the means, the ability to actually establish control. Um, Now, since then, the Russians have brought in a lot of reserves, and now they're establishing a real firm line of contact. And before you had sort of like one big gray zone, a gray zone where there's sort of a big no man's land, where there are bands of Ukrainians and bands of Russians, right, inhabiting the same space and ambushing each other. But now we're beginning to see kind of, again, like what we see on the rest of the line of contact, a fairly stable line with the Russians on one side and the Ukrainians on the other. There's still some leftover from those, some gray zone, fairly extensive territory left from the initial first days of chaos, but the Russians are in the process of mopping that up. So, they've stabilized the front there, and then they're going to just continue to pound away at the Ukrainians as they are now, and eventually they're going to push them out. I don't have any doubt about it. And this whole thing will be over, and the losses among the Ukrainians is going to be huge. In the short run, they're just making all kinds of, um, let's say, political hay. They're 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 taking advantage. It's been very beneficial for the narrative. Yeah, the focus has shifted from the Donbass, where the news is really dismal for the Ukrainians and continues to be, and in fact is getting worse by the day over there. But the focus isn't on that anymore. It's on Kursk, and the Ukrainians have managed to generate a lot of sensational headlines that 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 again portray them as these really brilliant underdogs that once again have humiliated the Russians, and they'll get that for a few more days, maybe even a couple more weeks, but eventually it's going to die out. Eventually, they're going to be pushed out. It's going to be over, and then, but will Putin do something beyond that? Clearly he's got to push them out. We'll see. Again, there was the thought that actually, and I believe was his intention, is to launch some sort of major offensive at some point to take He does have all those units in reserve, and we were expecting it actually to occur where the Ukrainians struck first with their offensive here. Maybe that's this Ukrainian incursion will be followed up by a massive Russian offensive, but I don't know. I don't know what he has up his sleeve.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, Putin also said basically after this incursion that any idea of negotiations now are completely off the table, right? So this after this incursion, to me, it seems like the option now is only total surrender for Ukraine. Is
Yeah,
that true?
I think that's true. I think that was pretty much true beforehand, um, but it's definitely true now.
Well, there was, I heard that there was a deal being brokered by the Qataris between the Russians and the Ukrainians for not exactly a ceasefire, but that Russia would stop using its missiles to strike energy infrastructure, and Ukraine would stop using its drones to strike Russian infrastructure. And to me, this seems like a great deal for the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians are getting
Right,
pounded and being destroyed
right.
when it comes to energy infrastructure. And if this deal was going through, they just shot themselves in the foot. This deal benefits the Ukrainians way more than it benefits the Russians. The Russians don't have any problems with energy. Can you verify if this deal is going forward? And I heard that the Chinese were involved in trying to negotiate this thing, and the Chinese are furious. Basically everybody's pissed off at Ukraine because they just go through these waves of escalation, and undermine any type of ability to have diplomacy or peace talks. Or really, we should say maybe Ukraine is undermining it, but more so the U.S. and the U.K. are at its
Yeah.
heels, making sure that no peace is ever established. Can you speak on that at all?
Well, I've heard. Well, first of all, the Russian government has denied that it was involved in negotiations. That I think that came out last
Oh,
night.
really?
Yeah, Maria Zakharova stated that. Now, and then there was some other news that came out and said, well, they didn't actually ever get together and negotiate. I guess it was sort of like talk about having negotiations. That's as far as it got. Um, but I, I, I fail to see actually what benefit that would um, bring to the Russians, because as you say, the Russians have been pounding Ukrainian infrastructure. They've destroyed more than half of it, and what Ukraine has managed to pull off is just little pinpricks that hasn't even affected the price of, uh, of gas here in Russia. Um, so it just seems like it's so lopsided that it just doesn't really seem like any deal that it would be worth, you know, that would be worth the Russians' while, right? It's sort of like it's a
Right.
99% to 1%. You say, okay, I'll give up my 99% if you give up your 1%. That doesn't sound like a good deal. So I have trouble believing it. The only thing I can think of is that like if the Russians had already pretty much decided that they had gone as far as they wanted on the energy infrastructure front, and then they say, okay, well, we can do this to make our partners happy, like China or whatever. But still, um, still that doesn't make sense because you don't know what's going to happen down the road, and you have so much more capacity in that regard. The Russians just there's a huge overmatch on the Russian side with regards to missiles and drones and so forth. They can do so much damage. So if somewhere down the road it clearly came to their advantage, or it would be helpful if they could strike another substation or another power plant. Um, why tie their hands when the other side really wasn't doing anything? Those were little pinprick attacks that were having no effect. So the other side was not giving up anything. No matter how you look at it, the Russians would be giving up a lot. I, I, it's just hard for me to believe that they actually had any serious intent to negotiate a ceasefire.
Mhm. Um, when so far with the Russian special military operation here in Ukraine, it seems like they've been kind of not going. They're still got their boxing gloves on. It doesn't seem like they're going full on, right? I mean, what do you think? Now are they going to move if they're only using like 30% of their power? Or do you think they're going to be moving up dialing it way up now, and that we're going to see some really heavy strikes moving in, a lot more reserves coming in and just plowing through? Or do you think there's even a possibility in response to this that Russia could even potentially strike some NATO bases in Poland or whatever that are helping, the Ukrainian side here? Because Ukraine is using NATO equipment. We're seeing German
Hmm.
tanks and U.S. equipment rolling into Russia. I imagine there's a lot of anger in Russia saying, well, if they're sending their equipment into our country, invading our country, then we can do that to the countries that are allowing that to happen, providing it. Do
Right.
you think that's a possibility, or that's still completely off the table?
I think that's off the table. It's just, again, it might be emotionally satisfying, but it's still not to Russia's advantage to do that. Meaning, because then
Mhm.
it gives NATO the chance to invoke Article 5, and all those hotheads on the NATO side could feel perfectly justified in sending in thousands of NATO troops. Now, I think in the end, actually, Russia, if it really does come down to a war between NATO, all of NATO and Russia, I think Russia is still going to win, but they don't want that to happen. That makes this much more difficult. It probably means that they're going to have to mobilize much more of their manpower, and Putin doesn't want to do that. Um, but yeah, there are other things that could happen. I mean, there may be a major offensive. We've been predicting that. There have been signs that there may be one in the offing. One of the reasons that, um, at least I've heard from a couple different sources, that the Ukrainians were able to strike across um, the border so quickly is that the area had been demined. And why would it be demined? I think only because the Russians are intending at some point at crossing from their side, right? So I think I think we can expect to see. Now, it's actually even easier for Putin to justify this to the world, is say that, okay, they invaded our territory. Clearly, we need to go in and establish a buffer zone and make sure this never happens again. Um, so I would be surprised if there wasn't some kind of offensive in that area. I think at least a buffer zone, like the size of the Kharkov buffer zone that the Russians carved out a couple of months ago, when they're still fighting. The line of contact has barely moved. It's moving forward very gradually in Volchansk. The Russians are still progressing, but we're talking about like 50 meters or 100 meters a day, maybe, on a good day. Um, but I think they basically got the land that they wanted to. They established the buffer zone. They may do something similar. I think at least that, but it might be a lot more. Another thing that Putin might do is he might actually go ahead and just strike, um, uh, let's say, government offices in Kiev that have been that have been spared until now. It's just to show that, yeah, as a warning. I don't think he'd try to assassinate Zelensky, but it just made me say, look, if you do another stunt like this, maybe maybe we will take you out. Take out his presidential. I don't know exactly what the Ukrainians have. They don't have a White House, but some sort of symbol of presidential prestige in Kiev. I could see that happening, but who knows? Um, like it looks like the way that Putin responded to earlier provocations, like the recent decision to begin, to openly allow the Ukrainians to use HIMARS and other weapon systems to strike into pre 2014 Russian territory. Uh, the way that Putin, he said that, okay, well, is basically what's happened here is that the West has allowed Ukraine to strike us directly. So they're striking us through a proxy. Well, we can do the same. We can strike them through a proxy. He went off to North Korea and he signed that uh, mutual defense pact. And then we see what's happening in Iran. I think that that's the way that he responded to it. He said before he had shown restraint in that, but now he's not. Okay, if you're going to use a proxy against us, we're not going to have any qualms about using a proxy against you. Um, so who knows? It may be, it's something along those lines. They may just kind of continue down that road, arm the Houthis directly. Apparently there was a possibility that they were going to give them anti-ship missiles, and then they decided to call it off. They might, the Russians did. So maybe the Russians are going to go ahead and um, just arm the Houthis, with missiles that could sink an aircraft carrier. Perhaps that's how he might respond.
Oh man, the Middle East is the real hotspot, I feel like. I mean, it's scary what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, and we're escalating further and further, actually sending our missiles and our equipment into Russia. I don't like that at all, but it is true. The Middle East is the real hotspot. I just feel like a major war is going to break out very soon, and the U.S. is going to be directly involved, and Russia's going to be more involved than people realize. I think a lot of people
Uh-huh.
don't realize Russia's strategic interest and its alliances it has in the Middle East. It has bases in Syria. It's Iran is part of BRICS. Russia is there in Iran right now, getting everything ready. I mean, I've been stressed myself just waiting for this Iranian retaliation. I just got to imagine how the people in Israel and Iran have to be feeling just waiting
Yeah.
for this thing. And I don't know. I feel like this is going to be the week. I feel like we're coming close to 3 weeks
Right.
since the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh. Some people are saying that, oh, Iran's blinking, they're not going to do it. I know Iran's going to retaliate. They have no choice. I think a lot of what they're doing right now is just making sure, sort of shoring up all of their alliances and people around the world, and giving them the justification, saying like, look, we have to retaliate. This is what Israel won't stop attacking us
Hmm.
and doing these types of things. This is within our rights, just to make sure everybody knows that this is going to happen, and to make sure that the world opinion is basically on Iran's side. And I think it
Hmm.
is. I mean, just if we just look at the Gaza conflict, 90% of the world is against Israel on this because of the genocide they're enacting. I mean, and
Right.
then Israel strikes an embassy building, a consulate building in Damascus, killing 12 people, 12 Iranians. That's never been done. Diplomacy, like
Yeah.
other than
Right.
when the U.S. struck the embassy in Serbia during the Kosovo wars. Uh, and then Ismail Haniyeh, I think people just wanted to say, oh, he's a terrorist. No, he's the political leader of Hamas. He is actually a moderate, was open to giving
Hmm.
up 80% of the land to the Israelis just for a two-state solution. And he was the one that's in charge of negotiating a ceasefire deal. And he was in Iran as a guest. This is like the he was in a place to stay that's the equivalent of what's, I forget what the White House is, but where foreign leaders and dignitaries stay that are guests of this country. It's such a slap in the face for all of
Yeah.
Iranians that this honored
Right.
guest that's here, that was to celebrate the inauguration of the president of Iran, gives a hug to the president of Iran, and then they kill him in this guest suite, for foreign leaders. It's a huge provocation, and it's like, look, if Israel wanted to kill Hania, they didn't have to do it in Tehran.
Hmm.
Hania doesn't stay in Tehran. He's in Qatar, other places. They did it specifically in Tehran because they're trying to provoke this war, and start this war. And so I think Iran is really sort of taking its time, making sure that everybody in the world is kind of on its side, and it is, I believe,
Hmm.
except for the United States, Israel, and just the Western
Yeah.
European countries. But
Right.
even the Western European countries are just kind of by name, but their populations aren't fully involved.
Yeah. The governments
Um,
are. I mean, they
so this
clearly
thing
are.
is right. The governments are, but I just don't. If this is the question, if the governments want war, but the people don't, it just can't happen, right? Because that's kind of the problem, I think, for the United States and NATO. You got these politicians, these hotheads that are like, yeah, we got to go in, go all out, but as far as I can tell, nobody in America really wants to do it, or maybe a few people, but most people aren't really excited or gung ho to go fight Iran, they don't understand. They might be like, "Oh yeah, I support Israel terrorists," but then when you really ask them, like, "Oh, you okay? Well, then go, strap up and and get over there." They're going to say
Hmm.
no. So I just don't understand when this war breaks out, because it is going to break out, and the U.S. is going to be involved. What can we really do if the people don't want to fight? The
Well,
people that
yeah.
do want to fight are the Arab countries that are being terrorized by Israel. Nobody wants to die for
Hmm.
Israel. I don't think, not many people here. They might say
Hmm.
until it really comes
Hmm.
down to it. I mean, what's going to happen?
Yeah. Well, I think that's right that you don't have um, any willingness to actually put boots on the ground, as they say in the Middle East. I think that's just completely off the table. That's not going to happen. Our government's not going to even try that. I think what people think of when they think of a war with Iran, they think of the first Persian Gulf War. They think of the Iraq War, and these were, broadly speaking, quick and easy wars that involved very few American casualties, and in which we wreaked a lot of devastation from the air, and from our Navy. I mean, again, a lot of these, of course, aircraft were launched from aircraft carriers. I think that's the kind of war that people are thinking, quick and easy. We can watch it on TV, and we got them outgunned. We've got the sophisticated weapons. We'll teach them a quick lesson. I But I don't think if we really do become involved in a war, a direct war with Iran, it's just not going to be that easy. Iran's not the pushover. Iraq was a very weakened country when we attacked it last. It had undergone very severe sanctions. Much of its population had starved. Um, and it was never the kind of power that Iran is now. Iran has had decades to develop. It's a much larger country with much larger population. And they've had a long time to think about how to fight a war with Israel and with the United States. They understand that both these countries are superior to them in certain areas, but
Oh,
there are ways of dealing with that. Iran's had a long time to prepare for this, to think about it, to play to their own strengths. And what they've done is they've invested heavily in missile technology, and they've had real successes, and in drones. These are the new technologies, and the U.S. in the meantime is, they do have missiles and drones, but they've also held on to the old technology. I think the aircraft carriers, for example. And I think in the new world, the aircraft carrier is just a big sitting duck, and that's what we may find. Now, Hezbollah, who would also be involved in this war, has a lot of rockets and missiles. And they've gone, like Hamas, they've gone underground. They've built, underground bases, long underground tunnels that they can drive vehicles down. And just as Hamas demonstrated in Gaza, Hamas is much, much weaker than Hezbollah. But because of their extensive system of tunnels, they've been impossible to defeat. The Israelis, outgunned them 100 to
okay, Dad,
1, but
I'm only
still.
getting about half of what you're saying,
Oh,
unfortunately.
oh, let's see, what can we do here?
It's
Okay, well, I was talking about uh, yeah, that again, Iran has had a long time to plan for this conflict. They understand what the strengths are of the U.S. and Israel, and rather than trying to meet them, strength for strength, they've gone for these new technologies, especially missile technologies and drones. And while the U.S. certainly has gone into these new technologies, they've also held on to the old ones. I think a lot of it is just a matter of prestige, like the aircraft carriers. Now, aircraft carriers are great for beating up on a third world country. They can't really defend itself. They were great when we attacked Iraq. Our aircraft could take off from them and bomb Iraq. They had no air defense. They had their Scud missiles, but they really weren't much worth anything. But now, in this new world, aircraft carriers are sitting ducks. They're big fat targets.
Mm.
And I think we'll find that. So the U.S. has these aircraft carriers, then it has all these military bases. Again, I think this was really very foolish. It was really about controlling Iraq, but it actually makes the U.S. more vulnerable in the case of a war with Iran. Now, Iran has already demonstrated that it can destroy these bases, um, with great precision. And then Hezbollah has done what Hamas did. They've built an extensive system of tunnels. Hamas showed how effective that tunnel system was for them. Again, in fighting Israel, they were and are outgunned by a factor of, let's say, 100 to 1, but they're still standing. And a good reason, or a big part of the reason that they're still standing is that they had that extensive system of tunnels. I mean, the Iranians can bomb them. They've dropped more bombs on them than apparently, the Allies dropped on Hiroshima, London, and Dresden combined during World War
You're
II.
talking about Israel, not Iran. Israel
Right.
on
I'm,
in Gaza. Yeah.
yeah, okay. Did I say
Yeah.
Iran? Forgive me if I did. Israel. We're talking about. They've dropped more bombs. Measured in kilotonnage. So when you're talking explosive power, than than the U.S. dropped on London, or not the U.S. didn't drop on London. Okay, I'm sorry, on Dresden and Hiroshima, and the third city I can't. Now it's
Nagasaki.
escaping. Nagasaki, probably. I don't know. But anyway, just for no, no, no. Okay. Well, anyway, it's just a huge amount of bombs, but Hamas is still standing because they've got this extensive system of tunnels, right? They can stay down there and they can survive these attacks. You can just, you can drop anything short of a nuclear weapon, and they're gonna survive and pop out and shoot at you again. Now, Hezbollah, which is much much stronger, a much more powerful military force than Hamas, they've done something very similar in southern Lebanon, and so yeah, they've also figured out, they've understood where that again they can't meet fight the Israeli using this on Israel's battlefield, which would really be the sky, right? They don't have an air force that Israel has, uh, but they can go underground, and then that, to a great extent, neutralizes the Israeli advantage. So I think if we
Mm.
find a war, I'm not going to say that Israel and the U.S. can't inflict a lot of damage on Hezbollah and on the Iranian armed forces, and certainly on the civilian infrastructures of both those countries. Um, but it's clear that those armies can inflict a lot of damage on the U.S. and on Israel, and it may not be. So for that reason, I don't think that we're going to find the kind of war that a lot of Americans are expecting. They're used to those quick and easy television wars that we got. The first Persian Gulf War, the Iraq War. It's not going to be a replay of that. This is a different age, and Iran's a different kind of opponent. So is Hezbollah.
Yeah, I think Iran's goal was to establish deterrence. When that embassy, that consulate building was hit in Damascus, that's what their response was. They
Hmm.
telegraphed it and showed Israel that, look, we can hit you. Your Iron Dome is not impenetrable. Even with
Right.
the help of the US, UK, France, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, we can still get through with this tiny barrage and we can hit you. Deterrence should have been established at that stage, but clearly Israel is not deterred. They won and
Right.
escalated further with this assassination of Ismail Haniyeh. So now the calculation, I think, for Iran is, are they going to try to establish deterrence again, or do they believe that deterrence is not even possible and that this is just the beginning of an all out war? Because when they strike, let's be honest, do you think it's going to deter Iran? I mean, deter Israel when they strike? I don't
Oh
think
no.
so. Israel is going to
No.
strike back, right? So is the
Right. Yeah.
deterrence game even over? It's so crazy. It's so suicidal for Israel. They just
Right.
show, and the United States, Iran showed like, hey, we're not messing around. We're not the third world country you think you are. Look,
Right.
we have hypersonic missiles. We have better missile technology than the United States and Israel. So what are you doing? We have shown you there's videos of evasive maneuvers of hypersonic missiles and ballistic missiles that are just evading Sidewinder or Iron Dome interceptors and striking targets in Israel. Apparently that didn't
Mm.
work. So now it's just all out war coming. That's what Iran is preparing for, I believe. Do you think they're trying to establish deterrence again, or do they realize that Well, deterrence doesn't work for these guys. They don't
Yeah.
care.
I'm They're going to try to establish deterrence, but I think they understand Israel well enough to know that there's a very good chance it won't work. I mean, this is, um, they're
I mean,
probably
they did
also going
a
to hope, right? I know. Well,
that.
what can you do? That's the thing is, what can they do?
Yeah,
That's
that
right.
that that, that first response was such a beauty in terms of establishing deterrence without going a full
Right,
out war. Very careful, calculated. We'll show our might.
right,
Zero
right,
civilian casualties. That
right.
should have been it. It should Israel should have been like, okay, let's don't
Yeah,
do this
yeah,
because Iran
right.
can blow us up if we want to. But what
Yeah,
does Israel do? They just go around and they do the most sort of
yeah,
heinous,
right,
covert
right,
assassination of a state leader guest possible
right.
in the
Yeah,
capital of Iran. It's just
right.
it's
Yeah, I
crazy.
think it right. I think you got it right. I was just thinking about that assassination. It's just hard to think of an equivalent, but let's say if we had some well-known European leader, who had led a lot of negotiations, and he came and he was a guest of the White House, and they put him up, maybe on the, let's say, at a nearby hotel or something like that, a place, a suite that is especially set aside for dignified for foreign dignitaries, and Iran struck the suite with a missile, killed this guy. Would we be actually still thinking about how we would respond? No, I think probably the next day there would be a fleet of bombers going over just to wipe out Iran. And then you
Mm.
think about what that Soleimani. It's hard to even think of somebody who's equivalent because I mean Soleimani. Not only was he a top general, but he was a real hero. Let's say I think you'd have to go back to World War II and somebody like Douglas MacArthur or Eisenhower or something. What if one of those had been, our heroes had been assassinated? Would we have responded with the restraint that Iran showed? Certainly not. We
Mm.
got to stop and think. You're just always like, oh, these crazy Iranians. No, these Iranians are very, very, very cautious. They've shown a tremendous restraint, but it's just obvious. Like we said earlier, after the first demonstration retaliation by Iran, we said that Netanyahu, he's not giving up. He wants war with Iran. He'll do something else, and he did it. That's what he wants. He wants war with Iran. And he thinks he can pull it off this time. Clearly he thinks he can win. Not by himself. I think he understands well enough that Israel is just not strong enough to defeat Iran, but he thinks with the might of the United States, he can win. And he believes that, here's Mr. 58 standing ovations. He believes that he's got the U.S. behind them and that they will strike Iran hard if, um, once Iran retaliates.
Do you think we would? Do you think America would strike Iran? Would we do what Netanyahu wants us to do like that? That just seems so
Yeah,
crazy.
right. It does. It does. I think that we will. I mean, just part of it is there is this tremendous, again, we're faced with elections and the whole Zionist issue is it's a big part of it. It's part of, um, of course it affects the voting public, but it's also something that's very important to the donor class too. The top donors on both sides are just fervid Zionists. So it's just hard for us not to do this. I think it's
Uh,
crazy. It shouldn't be that way, but that's where we are. This is the United States of today. Is actually just almost um, a servant to, maybe not quite a slave, but just an obedient servant of Israel.
how would we even strike Iran? Or would it be through aircraft carriers, submarines? I
Yeah,
mean,
well, I think it would be missiles, fired from various platforms. It could be submarines, but from naval vessels and from aircraft. And those
mm,
aircraft could be take off from bases in the region, but they also take off from aircraft carriers.
yeah, if I was in charge of of the military, it seems like boats aren't that great anymore because they're just floating on the top of the ocean and they can be targeted by these missiles and drones. submarines seem to be though quite effective though. Like,
right,
well, how could you counter a submarine? I mean, it's way
right,
underneath the water. It's just like you're talking about with the Hamas tunnels. You're
right,
dropping more tonnage than Dresden and Hiroshima on Gaza, but they're still standing. Why? Because they're underground. I mean, the same thing with subs. They're underground. So
right,
there's just
right.
a
Well,
lot
you
of
can
just sort
even
of.
right. Right. You can even say point to the same thing in Ukraine. It's just like when the Ukrainians are able to dig in, it really is hard to get them out, right? Yeah. Okay, they're not way underground like Hezbollah, but if you can get trenches and pillboxes, bunkers, um, you can hang on for a lot longer. But these days, you get out in the open, and there's the sky is full of drones, and the drones either fire at you directly, or they see you, and a signal is sent back to a missile launcher, and yeah, within a matter of seconds or minutes, the target is taken out. So yeah, it's just best to stay underground or underwater if you can, right?
Right. Yeah, it actually makes a lot of common sense. And I feel like this is the problem with the RMIC is that we don't ever do any kind of cost benefit analysis with our weaponry.
Yeah,
It's just like you can spend what is it, $5 billion for an aircraft carrier or something like this. I don't
easily.
know
Yeah,
how much. Yeah, but
it,
it's clear that the what you're getting most bang for your buck for are drones, missiles,
right.
subs. These things seem to be very effective and are hard to take out. But we've gone
Yeah,
over this many times that we
right,
just kind of
right,
throw money, good money after
yeah,
bad. That's what we do.
right. Yeah,
Uh,
you don't do a cost benefit analysis. It's probably the cost benefit analysis is for the lobbyists, the congressmen, or whatever, and it's actually like the more money spent, the better. So
mm,
everybody loves the big expensive items. That just means lots of jobs and a lot
right.
of,
More
a
cost, more
lot of
benefit.
yeah.
That's what it is.
That's the exactly right. A lot of
It's a
pockets
more
get
cost, more
filled.
benefit
Yeah,
analysis.
yeah. But
Right.
like the things, the um, kind of the mundane, boring things like artillery shells and FPV drones. These are low profit, low cost items. Yeah, hey, nobody's interested in that kind of stuff. Not much benefit for the lobbyists there.
Yeah, it amazes me that the US military, Western military, doesn't seem to be able to think more than one move ahead. I mean, let's think about the Kursk incursion, for example. Okay, great. You get some brilliant PR for a week or 2 weeks. Did anybody think about what's going to happen next? Has anybody read a history book? What happens when you invade Russia? It never works out well for anybody. Just, talk Napoleon, Hitler, any scenario. It just doesn't work out. What's your idea?
Yeah,
Like you captured
right,
some useless villages in the middle of some wilderness. You
right.
captured a lot of woodland. What military benefit or strategy this has? Everybody, hurrah, hurrah,
Mm,
we did it. We got some Russian land. For now,
yeah,
they're all dead men
right.
now. Good job.
Yeah,
And
right,
it's absurd. And then the same
right.
thing here with we were just talking about the Israel-Iran situation. You think that the U.S. is probably going to strike Iran. Did anybody think about what's going to happen next? What about our
Mhm.
50 military bases in the Middle East? They don't have
Yeah,
any air defense. They don't
right.
have any ability to
Yeah,
defend against what Israel does. Our aircraft carriers that we're sending there. Anybody think about what happens after our planes take off and try to strike Iran? I mean, or even put it calculated the fact that they're now S-400 air defense missile systems now in Iran, and they have electronic warfare systems. It doesn't seem like it. I feel like we're a 3 year old, just pushing that little blocks on a wire going back and forth without any being able to think about what's going to happen next or be able to, that was a bad analogy, doesn't matter, but you
okay.
you you know what I'm talking about.
Sure, sure.
Right?
Okay. Yeah, well, I think you're describing our political leadership fairly. I mean, I don't think they understand. They don't really understand that there are limits to Western power, and they don't know really anything about the physical reality of military conflict. For them, it's all a matter of rhetoric and will and photo ops and this is how these people think. Now, I think when you get into the militaries within the IDF, within the Pentagon, they actually there are people who do understand it pretty well, but they often just get pushed aside. It's the people that tend to rise to the top are the ones who tell the politicians what they want to hear. Um, it's clear there has been a reluctance on the part of the Pentagon to get involved in a war with Iran, because I think a lot of them do understand that this would not be a cakewalk. It's not like it's not going to be a repeat of the Iraq War. They do understand that, and I'm sure that some of them have tried to tell the administration, and perhaps they've gotten through in the past. But there's always the hotheads, both well, especially in the State Department, but within the Pentagon too, and maybe in the Pentagon it's not so much the hotheads, but just um, the career ladder climbers, just the bootleggers, the ones who just know, who got to where they were because they always said what the politicians wanted to hear. And and if there is some sort of battle taking place within the Pentagon, it's between the bootlickers and the realists. And let's just
Yeah, well, if they're bootlickers, that means they're basically they're politicians themselves, and I think that's what
yeah.
Lloyd Austin is. Lloyd Austin is more of a politician than he is a real military general, and I think that was clear when Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated. Instead of condemning it, he comes out straight and says, "We will defend Israel." Basically, just saying that it was perfectly fine what Israel did, and we got their back, and we'll go to war with them. We'll go to war. We'll stand alongside Israel as they drag us into World War III. I mean, he's that's not a calculation made by a true somebody that's a military strategist. That's a calculation made by a politician. So the
Yeah.
Pentagon is run by politicians. So I think so. Now we're just going to walk into this war. At
I
least
think
I
there's a
think
very
so.
Yeah, I think there's a very, very good chance of it. It's not a certainty. Nothing's a certainty, but there's a high probability that we will.
Yeah, it's just I'm just afraid when that first base in the Middle East gets wiped out and we have American casualties start to mount up, the war machine here in the United States is going to go crazy, and they're going to do everything they can to drum people up to say like we're under attack instead of
Hmm.
realizing that we are the ones that are attacking, and it's where we're doing it for Israel, that we're sending our sons and daughters to die for Israel, not for the United States. I'm afraid that messaging, that the truth will get buried. The
Oh
first
yeah,
casualty of war
right.
is always
It'll
the
be buried
truth.
very quickly. Right. No question about it.
Well, hopefully there will be enough pushback here in the United States, enough people questioning it. I think social media does help. I think there is a global consensus that what Israel is doing is wrong. There are more and more people really coming out and speaking out against Israel. It's very encouraging. For example, I don't know if you know much about Candace Owens. Like she has
Yeah.
been really coming out strong, and I think is helping that conservative base as well that
Right.
is traditionally very pro-Israel,
Right.
to kind of realize that, hey, these are not the allies of Christians or Christianity. This
Right.
is
Right.
this is not what we're doing. And she's becoming very, she converted to Catholicism. She's quite religious now. So I'm seeing some hopeful trends. And these people have a lot of reach, and I think more power than people realize. I know
Yeah.
mainstream media, the
Yeah.
real power,
Right.
Tucker
Tucker
Carlson, of
Carlson.
course.
Right. Right.
Right, yeah, great. But I think the problem with the real power of mainstream media is sort of this academic laundering of the truth, because once it's under the New York Times or the Washington Post, if you
Mm.
do a Google search, if somebody gets in an argument with you online, it's like, well, I'll prove it to you, I'll Google it to you. Well, these are the authoritative sources and they say
Right.
it is,
Right.
and it's like, what is this? I haven't heard of the gray zone. That's not a real thing. That's the
Right.
propaganda. That's the
Right. Right.
problem, is that everybody just
Yeah.
assumes that this makes it legitimate. And of course, all these search engines, in terms of
Yeah.
SEO, this is what gives it credibility, are
Right.
these
Yeah.
old established
Right. It's the
propaganda
right.
websites that they're
Right.
not news anymore.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know.
Still, I think it's still a majority of people tend to rely on yeah the establishment media, and I think that's especially true among the elite. The political elite, the cultural elite, the academic elite. You would think that the academic elite would produce a lot of people, who question and move beyond the establishment, but unfortunately, it's not true in this country. They really are servants of the establishment. That they help to buttress the establishment. They like to pretend they're revolutionaries, but that's the whole game that everybody plays. Everybody's sort of a revolutionary, but they all think the same thing, right? And it's the way
Mhm.
the establishment thinks.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the more shocking things to realize that there's a real monopoly on information. You think that there would be a strong incentive for at least one newspaper, one mainstream establishment
Hmm.
newspaper to break away and tell the truth because it would resonate because once
Yeah,
the truth is laid out in plain English for everybody to see, it resonates with everybody. Like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We're constantly being confused and our minds are being contorted by all these strange stories and narratives that are trying to convince us one thing that doesn't fully make sense, but they do it. They use enough fancy language that you're like, I guess that's true. It is the Wall Street Journal. I guess that's got
yeah,
to be right. Um,
yeah.
but
And when
but
you're
why?
as and the thing to remember is that most people are embedded in institutions, meaning that you work at a university, right? You teach at a university and the faculty, and if everybody's thinking one, it's really very hard to break away. You can find the gray zone, for example, but then if you bring it up among your colleagues, you're going to be laughed at, or you're going to be, and potentially you're going to be ostracized. I mean, it really does happen. Um, it does happen. Yeah, and it's it's not just academia, but it's the media in general. They actually tend to be very very conformist, and when you're within that crowd, it's easy to get home and read secretly these things and find out. But when you get there among those people, you realize that if you say the wrong thing, all those heads are going to turn, and then you're going to be the black sheep in the flock, and nobody
Right.
wants to be the black sheep.
Yeah, and the problem is also that once you're vindicated because you're saying like, "Hey, this story you're saying doesn't seem to be true. This is the truth,"
Yeah.
and then you get ostracized as the black sheep, and then you become vindicated when it's true, but nothing happens. They just go
Right.
on telling the
Yeah.
next lie, and everybody
Yeah.
just
Right.
forgets that like, "Hey, you lied about everything for the past
Yeah.
5 years.
Right.
Why am I still believing you?" I mean,
Right.
credibility is eroding slowly, but it just
Yeah.
amazes me
Right.
how long it takes. Like, how many times can you be lied to and still kind of just be like, oh, well, it's true, it's true. And it's just the power of language, I feel, of
Yeah. Oh,
just
yeah.
the,
No, it's, I find it too, of course, because I go to a lot of different alternative news sources. I'm aware of what's going on. But if you sit down and you just start reading articles or watching, different news shows, whether it's MSNBC or it's Fox News, you find yourself entering a new reality, and everybody talks like, oh, we all know this. Like it's just, these incidents, whatever, maybe know that that incident never occurred, but for them it's real, and they talk about it as real. And then if you went and said, oh, no, no, that actually never happened, or everybody would like, it's this guy. We all know, and it's just people together constantly repeating things. Again, we call it a narrative, right? The narrative gets established. The narrative has real power. It creates a reality, and that seems more real than reality sometimes. And you try to stand against it, and you're just you instantly appear as a fool. Somebody who doesn't get it. Get him out of here. Like Jeffrey
Mhm.
Sachs. I mean, again, we have a lot of people that we go to, people like Jeffrey Sachs, right? He used to be on all these mainstream news shows. They
Right.
all went to him. He was a world-renowned expert, somebody who'd worked together with prime ministers and presidents, and
Yeah.
has a hotline to the White House. And well,
No, he wrote
eh,
like half of my econ textbooks in college.
right,
Like that's
right,
where I know Jeffrey Sachs from, is from school,
right,
from college. I had to
right.
read about him.
Yeah, right. So I'd heard about him years and years ago, but but then it was, uh, I think it was actually Bloomberg News. He was being interviewed, and about the pipeline, the Nord Stream and the explosion. He said, well, clearly, he didn't have any doubt that the U.S. did it, and they just kind of their jaws dropped and looked at him like, what's this guy talking about? That was the last time he ever showed up in mainstream news. They said, get this guy out of here. He doesn't get it. This is not what you're supposed to say.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it's just
wild.
it's very powerful, and it's again, you can find alternative news sources, but people people live in those worlds. They live within those narratives. They are within these institutions, and it's not easy for people to break away, even if they have the means. Like it's just a few mouse clicks away, and you can find the information. You people have friends and colleagues, and they're just tied into this reality. It's just not, it takes a lot of guts, a real courage, and a determination to break away and find your own way. Uh,
Mhm.
Fortunately, there are brave souls that have done that, and we know who they are.
Right. Okay, I'll ask you one last question. How important do you think this election here is in the United States in terms of ending these conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine and Russia? I mean, do you think it really even matters at all? Like, is it just,
It potentially matters, especially Trump is a wild card. I've heard him referred to as a chaos agent. You just don't know what he's going to do. But and there is a chance. I have to admit it. I'm very cynical. I expect that nothing, if he's elected, nothing will really change. Even though he said a lot of good things about Ukraine, um, but I expect that nothing really will change. Um, and then for Kamala Harris, I'm sure nothing will change. I just I I'm almost positive nothing will change. It'll be the same kind of people. I mean, I think that's just going to be default Democrat establishment people. That's what it's going to be. And we won't get Tony Blinken himself, but we'll just get Tony Blinken, version 2.0. And that'll be true for everything else. I don't think we're going to see any serious change. There's some hope that something will happen on the Palestinian front. But when, again, I haven't seen any evidence that she's occasionally used some rhetoric that's shown some sympathy, but so has Biden. When I think we're talking about the realities that people are embedded. She's just too much a part of the Democratic Party establishment, and
yeah,
she's not. Let's be honest, she's not a very smart person. If you had somebody who was very smart and had a real backbone, maybe somebody like that could break away. I don't think she could break away, even if she wanted to. And I mean, with
yeah.
Trump, I think sometimes his instincts are good. He says the right thing, but I don't think he really, again, at least from what I've seen of him, especially in his first term, that he doesn't really have the intellectual discipline and the moral character to really break away from it. I think we're going to see more of the same, regardless of who is elected.
Okay, well, thanks for the dose of positivity. Yeah, it's true. It makes me sick when I see Trump. They're all trying to out Zionist each other. Except
Yeah,
Kamala actually seems to be kind of just not touching the subject as much, I think, to appeal to her base, which makes me
right.
slightly more
Yeah, they have to be
sympathetic to her.
careful. Same thing with with Biden. Biden was doing the same. They occasionally make sort of gestures
Right.
and
But
say this
then
is a problem, but they're not.
right.
But
Right. This is
Biden
the
has never done anything.
This is the Biden Harris administration, and they just approved another $20 billion of
$20
say
billion,
arms sales,
right?
20
Right,
billion to Israel to continue the genocide. So it's like, are you
right.
really against this? And then why are you
No, they're
not
not.
saying something about this?
They're
You
not
know,
against it.
and also when they say that it approved a sale, is it really Israel that's paying it, or is it really just the American taxpayer that's footing this bill?
Well, yeah.
I mean, the
I
money's
think, I mean,
coming.
is
We
there,
just
right. Well, I mean, we give it, Israel, outright give them at least, what, 3.5 billion a year. So we've been doing that forever. But there's other things. There are all kinds of breaks and whatever. I don't know what the real total
I,
is,
I
but
would
we're
like to
always just
see.
giving things to Israel.
Right. I would like to see that transaction. Is Israel actually paying us? Where are they getting that money from? Because I
Yeah.
guarantee you it's not Israel that's paying for it. It's the US taxpayer that's paying for it.
Yeah,
I'm
it
almost
always
certain.
is. Right.
And they said, oh, we approved $20 billion sale. Like, really? Well, you gave Israel $20 billion and then they gave it to us, and that was the sale. Um,
Yeah, I wouldn't be
anyways,
surprised.
right. Yeah, this election, I don't know. It's just not exciting. We talk about democracy and the importance of it, and it just doesn't feel like we have a real democracy here at all. We talk about all these evil countries like Iran and Russia, and I see what's happening there. It's like, hey, it looks like they got a lot better vibrant democracy in Iran than they do here in the United States. Um, It's a we're in a topsy-turvy world. Okay, Dad. Well, I guess maybe that's a good place to end it.
Okay.
We'll stop it there.
All right.
Okay. Have a good day.